Hi, how are you today? In this video, I'm going to be talking about what it was like to buy music in the 80s. I often like to talk about the 80s, of course. It's the decade that I grew up in. It's a decade that I remember very fondly. I have many good memories of that decade. So in this video, I'm going to be talking a bit about what it was like to buy new music in the 80s. Now, of course, this was way back before streaming, way back before downloading, long before MP3s and all of that. If you wanted new music, you had to go to a store and buy it. And many of us have fond memories of going to our local shopping mall, going to a record store and buying new music. Now, when I was really young, when I was say 12, 13 years old, the main format that I purchased was cassette. And really, in the 80s, cassette was the dominant format. It really was it. It was sort of the best-selling format. Of course, a lot of people were still buying vinyl. I was buying vinyl from time to time. And then later on in the mid to late 80s, CD became the real popular format. But for most of my childhood, for most of my youth, cassettes were definitely number one. And when I would buy new music back in the 80s, it would be on cassette. Now, having said that, as I mentioned a moment ago, vinyl, of course, was still quite popular well into the 80s. And I remember my parents, when they bought new music sort of in the 70s and well into the 80s, they were still buying music on vinyl and cassette as well. Now, I'll also mention something very interesting. Not that long ago, I did a video on 8-track cartridges. And 8-tracks were certainly very, very popular in the 70s, and I recall they were still fairly popular in the early part of the 80s. I would say up until 1981 or so, and then around, I think, 82, they really started to fade away. I certainly remember a lot of cars in the 70s and into the 80s had 8-track players in them, but eventually it was more and more cassette. Again, cassette was definitely the format. And it was certainly my preferred format. I had a really nice Lloyd's boombox, which I received when I was about 11 years old as a Christmas present. And I loved that thing. It had AM/FM cassette on it, and I loved taping songs off of the radio. Who didn't do that back then? That was really such a fun thing to do. Now, as I said, cassettes were definitely my preferred medium. But if I wanted to buy just a song, I didn't want to buy a whole album. Maybe I heard a really cool song on the radio that I really liked. And I wasn't quite ready to buy the whole album by that artist, but maybe I just wanted a copy of that song. If that was the case, I would buy what was called a 45. A 45 RPM record, or what is also called a 7-inch record. And back in those days, it was very easy to find 7-inch records. Every department store had them. When I was a kid here in Canada, we had a chain of department stores called Zellers, and they always had a home entertainment section, an electronics section, and they always had this sort of little shelf with slots in it. There'd be like 20 slots. And it would be like the 20 top selling singles of the day, and they would always have a chart, and so it would say number 1 was this record, number 2 was that record. So whatever record you were looking for, you would look for it on the chart, and let's say it was number 7, that record would be in the slot numbered number 7, and that's where you would find your 45. And I recall back in those times, a new 45 at that time cost about $3. Yeah. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but on average about $3. Now, since we're talking about price, I found at that time you could buy a brand new cassette usually for around $8.99, sometimes $7.99 if it was on sale. Usually the regular price for a cassette would be around $9.99 or $10.99. That would be just a regular release sitting on the racks, no sale, $9.99, $10.99. But if it would be on sale, it would usually be $8.99, $7.99, or sometimes even less. I remember some record stores would have these super sales, and sometimes cassettes would be as cheap as $4.99. That was a real deal back then, and I bought many of those deals at that time. Again, here in Canada, Some of the real popular record stores that I remember that would be at your local mall would be Sam the Record Man, A&A Records and Tapes. There was a chain called Discus. There was quite a few. There was quite a few to choose from, and again, a lot of the department stores also would sell records and tapes and eventually CDs. And I'm really happy to say that I still have a lot of the 45s, cassettes, and records that I bought back at that time. Now, since we're talking about vinyl, and I've mentioned this before in other videos, I noticed, especially when CDs came along, I remember CDs kind of really taking off around 1985, around the mid-80s. And right around that time, that's when you really started to see the decline of vinyl. It became harder and harder to find new vinyl in various stores. CD was slowly becoming the king. And I was still buying cassettes well into the late 80s and even into the 90s. I still preferred cassette, but slowly I started to buy more CDs. And today, certainly as I've mentioned before, my preferred format is CD. I still prefer CD over streaming. So that's just a little look back at buying music in the 80s. Of course, as I mentioned, cassette was big. Vinyl was still fairly popular up until about the mid-80s, and then CD around that time started to become the dominant format. So those are just a few little memories I have of buying music in the 80s. And another thing I will mention, people talk a lot nowadays about downloading music, getting music for free off of the internet, and how that can really hurt an artist. Back in the 80s, there was also a movement, and it was called Home Taping is Killing Music. And there were actually record sleeves at that time that would have this image on it, and it was sort of a cassette with crossbones. And it would say, home taping is killing music, and it's illegal too. Kind of warning people that if they borrowed a new release from their friend, took it home and made a cassette copy of it, that was really hurting music. Well, certainly I think it was. I wouldn't deny that. I wouldn't say that it wasn't hurting music. I'm sure it did have a great impact on music sales. But when you compare that to downloading, streaming, and what is popular nowadays, I can't help but feel that that was very, very small. And in comparison, that wasn't really as sort of hurtful as what we have going on nowadays. So, thank you for watching. If you have memories about buying music in the 80s, please share them. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, give us a thumbs up. Please, as always, subscribe to the channel. I'd love to have you join our family. I post new videos every week. Hope to see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.